All right, so those are our theorists for today, and we'll be exploring different theorists as we go through the different phases of the lifespan. Now we turn to developmental domains, and we're going to look at physical growth, motor skill, and play abilities. When we think about physical growth, birth weight triples by 1 year and then quadruples by the second year. So children have an enormous amount of physical growth in toddlerhood. In terms of motor skills, development follows a universal sequence. The pace, however, may be in response to the context of life and culture. An example is the average age for a child to walk. So in the U.S., we consider 12 months to be an average age for walking. That's the same in Canada. But if we look at other parts of the world, it changes. So in France, children tend to walk around 15 months. In Africa, they walk around 10 months. In Paraguay, they tend to not walk until 18 to 20 months. So we investigate this and look at normal, quote unquote, or typical, which I find is kind of a less loaded word. And we take context and culture into consideration when we're looking at these milestones and expectations. The last area that we're going to talk about is playability. So toddlers are beginning to notice other kids. They're not into sharing. They're beginning to engage in imaginative play. And as I said a little bit earlier, they're also engaging in parallel play. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into that as we go through the lecture. The first area we're going to look at is gross motor development. So in toddlerhood, motor skill increases in the areas of strength, coordination, mobility in terms of the toddler at the beginning of this phase, as I said, is off balance and does not walk with ease, but by the end of the phase, their stride length is longer. They're able to climb stairs independently. They're running. So it's an increase in mobility and locomotion for sure. There's also postural changes. Stability in standing develops, the ability to keep the body balanced and aligned. And then we talk about both static and dynamic postural stability. So when we hear the word static, it means still or unmoving. When we hear the word dynamic, we think about moving. So children are developing postural abilities when they're still and also when they're in motion. Also, the limits of stability increase, so kids can do more stuff and remain stable posturally. Another thing that comes into play in this toddler period is rotational movements. And rotational movements are more sophisticated, right? So when a toddler enters this phase, if we think about the planes or axes of the body, we have a left-right, we have a top-bottom, and we have a front and back. Rotational movements are along the body axis, and they help the child maintain balance. We'll go over this in class and look at some examples live, but if you can look at me in your little view screen, rotational movements are around the axis, right? So I am rotating or turning or twisting around the axis. Now, typically, the most central part to rotate is around the spine, okay? But we also bring into play the upper extremities, and if we were kicking, it would be the lower extremities and the hips. So rotation is a more sophisticated kind of movement. It starts coming out in toddlerhood, and it gets refined as children go into preschool and then into middle childhood. And it's marked because it's the first time it starts coming out is in toddlerhood. All right. The other thing that starts to happen is a judgment of force. Toddlers start to be able to judge the speed and the direction of control that's needed when attempting a task. So it's how much effort they have to put into their muscles to get the task done that they want to do. For example, flinging a ball, which is a skill that comes in with toddlerhood, and also the directional control. So if you've ever played catch with a young child, very young child, they may be trying to throw forward and instead they throw backwards or they throw out to the side. So as kids go through this 1 to 3 year period, they develop and refine the force, the speed, and the direction of effort as they're attempting tasks. Now, in your presenter notes, and you also have the slide deck on Canvas, you'll see that there are many gross motor milestones. I'm often asked by students, do I need to memorize these gross motor milestones or fine motor or communication, whatever the domain is? My thought for you is you should be very, very familiar with them. Am I going to ask you on an exam a really obscure developmental milestone? No. On the other hand, am I going to ask you what is the typical age that a child sits up, crawls, walks, says their first word, plays in parallel, plays with others? Yes, absolutely. That is a piece of what this class is teaching you and what we would like you to know, with the goal of embracing and understanding typical development so that when you see atypical development, you're able to recognize it. So gross motor milestones in the presenter notes, and as we go through this lecture and subsequent lectures, you will also have a wealth of information in the presenter notes to help you and round out your information and knowledge. All right. Let's move on to fine motor. So we have a big focus on gross motor because kids are doing so much with their large muscles, right? Standing and running and postural stability and rotational movements, right? Which we just talked about. The other part of this, however, is fine motor and tool use. And a tool could be a spoon, a tool could be a marker, it could be a toy hammer, it could be anything. So kids in toddlerhood are developing tool use. It's related to motor skill and it's influenced by cognition and motivation. Children in the toddler age are also developing bilateral hand use. So bilateral hand use is the ability to coordinate the two hands or the two sides of the body. It changes as the child moves through toddlerhood, and again, details are in the presenter notes, but by 1 year, an object can be held in each hand and moved in a mirror fashion, so the same way. From 1 to 2 years, a kid can hold an object in one hand and act on the object with the other. So I'm holding my doll and I'm brushing her hair. By 3 years, both hands can be active at the same time and working in concert, and they can be doing different things. Now, this is a very powerful foundational skill for writing when you need to hold your paper with one hand and write with the other. For any kind of ADL or IADL where you're stabilizing, say, a jar with one hand and twisting the lid off with the other, for scissor skills, for a wealth of future skills. So this is where it starts developing, the bilateral hand use. And when kids are having one hand lead and the other assist in manipulating objects, we call it bimanual coordination. All right, I'm really into fine motor in kids and gross motor, but fine motor is just super fascinating to me. So, object manipulation. Kids typically develop these skills between the ages of 2 and 4, and what starts happening is that they're able to move objects within their hand. It starts with finger to palm translation, and then palm to finger, and then rotation and shift. And we will be doing some prehension, looking at prehension in class and experimenting with prehension. So stay tuned for that. But these skills start developing in toddlerhood, and we will have an online lab to further explore it. All right. Again, I've given you milestones to think about, and they're typically for the toddler divided into 6-month periods. The next area we want to talk about is ocular-motor. This is eye movement, and it is voluntary or volitional eye movement, so it's under the child's control. As the child goes into toddlerhood, the coordinated use of the eyes and the hands together starts to develop. Skill increases for pursuits and scanning. So a pursuit is I see something over to my left and I look to the left, to the right and I look to the right, right? And scanning is the smooth coordinated movement of the eyes from one area to another. Another area that increases during this time is visual perception. So visual perception is the connection between the eyes and the brain, and children start to be able to discriminate shape, size, color, and other aspects of objects. This precedes the ability to copy forms when drawing, right? So if you can identify the characteristics of an object or a toy, then you become, that forms the foundation for being able to identify the characteristics of a letter, for example, or a square or a triangle. So the ocular-motor piece is also very important for forming the foundation for later skills. The next area we want to look at is sensory. So sensory processing happens all throughout life, but toddlerhood is an important time for it. The tactile, vestibular, and proprioceptive systems are very foundational, and they are vital for providing the child with information about the world and also information about their internal state. And then during toddlerhood, auditory and visual senses also gain influence. So kids become much more tuned into what's happening auditorily in the environment, and also to using their eyes to explore and to act upon their environment, or at least make decisions about acting upon their environment. The child's ability to integrate sensory information from a variety of senses permits accurate categorization of perceptual information, self-regulation, and increased motor coordination and control. This is a pretty complex concept, and so we will revisit as we go through various activities and discussions in class and online in our discussions. So if that did not make 100% sense, that's totally okay. We're going to revisit. All right. Our next area is cognition. And cognition in young children is often demonstrated not through deep thought about something, but through the type and quality of physical and play occupations. So we're kind of seeing what a child's brain is doing as they engage in physical activity and play activity. And often physical and play are one and the same. Again, I've provided you with milestones for 12 to 18 months, 18 to 24, and 24 to 36. And you'll note with all of the the milestones, cognitive included, there's an increase in the sophistication that happens in the periods through toddlerhood. So kids enter just starting to demonstrate some of the skills, and they leave with a really pretty robust understanding of what's going on. Our next domain is communication. Communication is both receptive and expressive. So receptive meaning I hear and I understand, and expressive meaning I can talk to you, I can communicate with you, right? And the length of utterance, in other words, how long a child's utterance or a string of words is, increases drastically through toddlerhood, and their vocabulary increases quite a lot. Children understand before they speak, and that said, the first word happens around 12 months, sometimes younger, and they definitely babble younger. The first sentence is about 18 to 24 months, and at 18 to 24 months, they have 12 words and telegraphic speech, which basically means 2-word sentences that have meaning. By 20 to 30 months, they have complete sentences, and by 3 years, they have 1,000-word vocabulary. In your presenter notes, I've added a bunch of resources that talk about how socioeconomic status and parenting can influence the size of the vocabulary that children have, and how that then can influence children all throughout their schooling and indeed throughout their lives. It's pretty interesting research. Basically, upper and middle class children hear many, many, many more words than working class and poor children, and it sets up a disparity that continues throughout childhood and into adulthood. Think about it. If you don't have early language enrichment and then you go into school, that's going to be hindered. And all throughout K-12, right, is going to, you may be hindered. And then that is going to act as an obstacle to potentially going to college, which then acts as an obstacle in the work world. So it's this very interesting and kind of tragic cascade of effects that start with how big is your vocabulary and how much language enrichment are you receiving at home. So when we consider communication, we also want to consider cultural and contextual components of communication as we're working with kids. Our next area is self-care. And children that are in their toddler period are developing a lot of ADLs, or activities of daily living. They're also starting to develop IADLs, or independent activities of daily living. ADLs that happen during toddlerhood are feeding themselves, and this starts way back in infancy at around 6 to 8 months, where they're feeding with their fingers, and spoon use at 10 months. But during toddlerhood, that's all getting very much refined. Potty training usually happens by around age 3, although again, that varies very dramatically depending on culture and family structure and tradition. Undressing happens before dressing, and undressing happens around 18 months of age. And then the child is also dressing and bathing themselves by about 2 to 3 years, but they're performing with assistance. So they're not independent yet. They're not doing fasteners yet. They're not tying their shoes yet, but they're cooperating and helping with dressing and bathing, and in some cases doing a number of the steps on their own. In terms of IADLs, children that are in later toddlerhood can often help with things like picking up toys and cleaning their play area, setting the table, washing food like veggies and fruits, or helping to fold clothes. All of this performance requires adult supervision, but children are starting to engage in household maintenance and household chores. The order in which children develop ADLs varies with culture and experience, so some are going to happen sooner or later depending on the child's home culture. And children first learn skills that are highly valued by their parents. So that can be related to culture. It can also be related to parenting style, to how parents were raised themselves, etc. But it doesn't happen like everybody gets toileting, then everybody gets dressing. It's all very uneven, and in that unevenness, it's all typical. In North America, what we value is oral hygiene, eating, dressing, and toilet hygiene. This is not a universal pattern, but just an example to show you what one culture kind of takes to be the typical progression of ADLs.